that's not how it happened. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time needs no introduction. But you're gonna sit there while I introduce the fuck out of it. In the early aughts, a team at Ubisoft Montreal began prototyping a 3D action game with the intent of it becoming a new Prince of Persia. Now wait, let's just rewind. Due to an almost never-ending cascade of financial bumbling, the rights to various broader-bun franchises passed to the Learning Company, and then eventually were sold to Ubisoft. Now, while Ubi held the rights to the existing entries in the IP, they did not have the ability to make a brand new title of their own accord. Those rights were reacquired by one Jordan Mechner. At the time, Ubisoft had just started making waves with the success of the earlier Tom Clancy titles and really wanted to move forward with a new Persia. The team put together some animation tests and invited Jordan to see what they were working on. Even though those early tests were the only work they had to show, Mechner came away quite impressed with the possibilities it presented, so it wasn't before long he was working with the team to bring the prince to the third dimension like he always deserved. Despite being initially hired as a consultant, Mechner actually wound up writing the full script and did all the ADR directing for the voice acting. The pop team at Ubisoft saw what made the original great: tight and elegant platforming, thrilling combat, and a distinct atmosphere and mood that, while the team was light on experience, after years of hard work, they were able to deliver a title that wound up being in a number of Game of the Year lists. Not bad considering the franchise was considered dead just 3 years prior. Now, for all intents and purposes, Sands of Time was a reboot, or rather just another mystical tale or legend that was whispered about in the ancient world. No longer is there a princess to be saved or a strict time limit to adhere to, but a much more grand, rich, and detailed adventure awaited the still nameless prince this time around. He is now the respected son of Shahraman, a king of Persia who gets duped into stealing the Sands of Time, a deadly force of nature that corrupts all life if it escapes the confines of its hourglass. The heel of our tale is the sneaky vizier, who also happens to be the right hand of the king and wants the Sands power for himself, and thus manipulates the prince into unleashing it. This is the setup for Ubisoft's first, and some will say best, entry into the franchise, and while we'll explore that a little bit more later on, it remains an incredibly well-realized and enthralling tale from start to finish. Over the course of his quest to dispel the raging Sands and stop the vizier, the prince encounters Farah, the only other survivor of the Sands magic, who reluctantly teams with him as they have a common goal. While they work together to conquer the traps and dangers of Azad, they slowly reveal more about themselves to each other. Their initial frosty relationship begins to thaw because both characters change throughout their trials and tribulations. This then marks a running theme for most of Ubisoft's titles that carry the Persia name. The prince and some type of companion speak and interact as time progresses, and you begin to really care about the characters. This was a rarity in video games in the first few years of the PS2, GameCube, Xbox era because, hell, the industry was still sometimes struggling with good 3D cameras, let alone subtle and nuanced narratives. This is where a lot of the love and fondness for Sands of Time comes from, the prince thinking to himself as he platforms, agonizing over his plight. The guest rooms, where my father, all our entourage, and I should have passed the night lay cold and silent. The Sands of Time had swept through, stealing life and warmth from everything they touched.
Farah's little jabs at his expense as she initially blamed him for the cataclysm.
The daughter of the Maharaja from whom you stole it. This is your doing.
While the story does have a hint of fairy tale cheesiness, it's nevertheless a charming and genuine ride throughout.
Now, coupled with all this, Sands of Time also happens to do the unimaginable and create a gameplay loop that somehow matches the finesse and care that was taken into the story and characterization. While I will say that nowadays, if you were to grab the controller, you might find that some jumps, dagger stabs, and wall runs could feel just a bit more polished and responsive, especially during the combat, but I'd be lying if I didn't say Sands of Time still holds up as an absolute joy to play. The sheer amount of acrobatic moves at the prince's disposal, the time rewind mechanic, the puzzle solving, the music, the voice acting, it all makes for an intoxicating potion that may not wow every new player today, but in 2003, a lot of this stuff was mind-blowing. Think about how many action games you've played where there was some type of walled traversal move, or a game that manipulated time. While it might not have been the first that introduced those same gameplay hooks, it had almost certainly perfected them. Every room you were presented with was a new idea or a challenge that you had to unravel, and with careful use of the camera to examine your surroundings. You then took all that visual information, plotted your next course, and nailed that perfect run. Well, at least you had those sand tanks. Aside from the speed of the prince being a bit on the slow side, or the controls sometimes feeling a bit spotty, personally there's only two things that I thought, even at the time of the game's launch, were small but noticeable blemishes on an otherwise impeccable silk sheet. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was the longest pop game up to that point, and you do a lot of platforming, which is always a joy. The combat also takes up a good chunk of the game as well, which I always found runs out of steam eventually. While the prince has a fair amount of fun moves and gains more during his various battles, he doesn't have enough in his repertoire to make killing the same sand monsters over and over again feel as exciting as when you first encountered them. There simply isn't enough enemy variety on display here that requires drastically different methods to kill. In fact, killing almost every single enemy is always the same: the Dagger of Time. Since all the human beings and animals in Azad were transformed into sand zambimbis, they can only be killed by the dagger, which tends to make the later waves of enemies feel a little tedious to go through. That's not to say that the combat isn't fun, it's just that there isn't enough depth to match the game's length and pace. As we go through the various pop titles Ubisoft has produced, we'll see that combat is one of its most continuous sticking points. Despite the franchise's platforming prowess, the art of fighting is something it never truly sticks its landing on. In an almost complete reversal of all that, however, comes the battle with the Vizier. Maybe it's because the prince is an adept sword fighter that only grows stronger as he fights the hordes of sand creatures, but the final showdown with the old goober is shockingly brief and fairly unsatisfying. It just sort of ends. He's a gross old man that coughs more than fucking Logan and doesn't really put up a fight fitting of the epic adventure that preceded it. A shame, but if you've beaten Sands of Time, then its ending cutscene more than makes up for that limp final battle. When I first beat the game back in 2003, I felt this way, and it still sorta sticks out at me as a weird choice. Again, much like the combat, this is something Ubisoft would seemingly try to rectify with each subsequent installment. Now, look, I could go on and on here, so I will. The prince's clothes shredding and tearing as his adventure rolls on. Gaining sand powers let him pull off some time trickery during combat. The classic games you can unlock. Amazing voice acting by Yuri Lowenthal, which was the voice actor's breakout role. And now, you know what? Now I'm done, actually. Now I'm done. Suffice to say that Ubisoft's first entry into the series is one of my favorite games of all time, and every year or two I'll play hours of it, and I own multiple physical and digital copies. It's fucking Sands of Time! With that said, however, and before we wrap it up, I can't forget its smaller baby brother, Sands of Time on the Game Boy Advance. Now, I never actually owned a GBA and only experienced its library through the DS, so I didn't get around to playing this version until years after the fact. While it can't really compete with how the console version looks and plays, it's still a charming and nostalgic take on the source material, using well-animated sprites more akin to the Mechner classics. While I'm not the biggest fan of its more wide open area take on level design, what's here is still a neat little adventure that's still pretty damn enjoyable. Hell, they even made Farah playable in this one, so that's a win-win. In fact, you can change to Farah with the tap of a button, as she comes into play far more regularly than on the consoles. You can switch out between her and the prince to solve various platforming puzzling, and she can even fire her bow at will. It's a neat little curio in the franchise, and I heartily recommend it more than, say, the Shadow and the Flame mobile remake. While Sands of Time was met with absolute critical success, completely revitalized an entire franchise, and made some massive innovations in the 3D action space, sales numbers sadly never made it quite a blockbuster. While there's many theories as to why, the most common one is Ubisoft cannibalizing its own sales as they released Beyond Good and Evil not even 2 weeks after Sans, resulting in fanbases maybe being split as to which high-quality Ubisoft action-adventure game they should spend their money on that holiday season. Still though, Ubisoft decided to press on with the Prince of Persia and make, let's say, some changes to the formula. So, rest assured, dear viewer/listener, because we'll surely be talking about stainless steel thongs and Godsmack next time on